This is Dan Schneider, and this is another American Television with Mitchell Hadley. This time we're going to be talking about our cousins from across the pond and the British influence on American television. But before we do, Mitch, if you could just give a little intro on who you are for those who have not seen any of our prior episodes.
Hi, thanks for having me back, Dan. Hi, everybody. My name is Mitchell Hadley, and I am a classic television historian and writer. I write about classic TV and its relationship with American culture at itsabouttv.com, and my book is called The Electronic Mirror, which looks at what classic TV tells us about who we were and who we are and everything in between. And my next book, which I'm hoping will come out next year, is called The Descent into Hell, and it takes a look at various classic television depictions of dystopian futures that may already be with us.
Well, we're going to be calling this the British invasion, and when people think of that term, naturally they think of the music from the early 60s that basically, well, maybe it didn't actually start with the Beatles, but the Beatles were the biggest carriers of that. And interestingly, the television invasion starts a few years earlier, even though it's sometimes not known as that, because I was Googling trying to see British television invasion, and there's really not much that even lists that. So why don't you define what you consider the British invasion or the first British invasion of American television?
Yep. The first British invasion, and we have to kind of set the stage briefly for that. When you look at the early 50s in American television, the predominant form of entertainment was home generated. By that I mean there were American programs. A lot of them were being generated as original programming by local stations as well as networks. Then, as now, one of the great movers of television was the movie industry. But there was a real shortage of available movies on television. That was because the studios still looked at television as a threat to their business, understandably so. What this resulted in, kind of inadvertently, was that ABC entered into a deal with the J. Arthur Rank organization to provide newer movies that were newer than the late 30s or early 40s. The practical meaning of this was that there was an overabundance of British movies being shown on television. And what that served to do was to have the American television viewer become accustomed to seeing British quality. And by quality, I don't necessarily mean good or bad. What I mean is everything from the British accents to the British way of life, the British class structure, the British settings, things that Americans might have vaguely been familiar with, but this allowed them to see it at greater depth on television. So that kind of sets the stage for the British invasion, the first British invasion. But oddly enough, I think that the first program that makes this possible is an American program. It's called Omnibus. And it debuts on television in 1952 as primarily for most of its run as the Sunday afternoon or early Sunday evening program. It's arts and culture, a broad range of programming, and sometime maybe we'll talk about Omnibus itself. But for our purposes, the key point to make here is that Omnibus was hosted by Alistair Cooke. Many people will recognize Cooke from Masterpiece Theater, but at this point in time, Cooke was quite well known in the United States. He had been a writer, a columnist for British newspapers. He had a famous feature called Letter from America, in which he gave Brits the American viewpoint of things. And in fact, at the time that we're talking, Cooke had already become an American citizen. He'd been a citizen for quite some time, but still there was something exceedingly British about him in his manner, in his cultivated vocabulary, in his very sophisticated yet genteel way that he presented things. And it was with an authority, and it was with this overriding sense of quality that whether he was doing a documentary on how the New York Times puts its paper together, or presenting a comedy by Jack Benny, or a drama by James Agee, or a variety of programs, he gave this an overall sense of quality. And what this served to do, even more than the earlier movies that I had mentioned, is to give Americans this feeling that there was something better about British television, or at least the potential of something better. Hook gave it a tremendous credibility. It was a credibility that perhaps wasn't reflective of British television as a whole. But in presenting Omnibus for as long as he did, there was this synergy between Cook and British television that I think paved the way for the eventual invasion that begins around 1955.
So this was not was this like an anthology series with dramatic components, or
Yes,
was this sort of like kitchen
it,
sink dramas?
Well, it was an amazing variety of things. As I say, James Agee wrote a series of dramas on Abraham Lincoln that were at the time considered the definitive rendition of Lincoln on television. But on the other hand, he would do musical comedies, operettas. There was a famous live broadcast of Jack Benny doing The Horn Blows at Midnight. And then there were more serious works. There were documentaries, profiles of everyone from Frank Lloyd Wright to, as I say, the editorial board of the New York Times. So it was really a little bit of something for everyone, and that's why it had the name Omnibus, because it had just a tremendous variety of things. The one thing that was constant that held the show together was Cook's appearance, whether he was introducing Leonard Bernstein doing The Messiah, or he was introducing the managing editor of the Times. He was always there, and he was always linking the various pieces, components of the show together.
See, when you said initially that you were going to talk about a show, I thought you were going to go to Alfred Hitchcock Presents. You also mentioned 1955, which was when that came on. Mm-hmm. By this time, was Hitchcock thought of as Americanized?
I think, for the most part, yes, because although he had had a successful career in Britain, most of his biggest hits had come in the United States, including some remakes of his earlier movies. And by the time he moves into TV, that's kind of a prestige move for the networks to be able to pick him up, even though all he's doing is introducing them and occasionally directing them. But he's giving that a credibility in the same way, maybe, although not to the same extent as Walt Disney did when he hosted Disneyland. It was the first glimmer of the movie industry beginning to understand the advantage of being on television and the possibilities of being able to do cross promotions.
Yeah, I think Hitchcock, in the 10 years that Alfred Hitchcock Presents, in both the half and full hour versions, I think he only directed like 28 or 30 episodes, something like that.
Very seldom more than 2 a year.
Yeah, he wasn't what Rod Serling was to the Twilight Zone.
Correct.
So after Omnibus, then what happens in 55? Do we get anything resembling like the golden age dramas of live television, or what comes next?
Well, it's interesting to look at, because CBS was trying to develop what they referred to as a children's hour of programming, and it would begin at 6:30 Eastern Time and would run for an hour after the evening news, but before the prime time schedule. And the programs they had included CBS Cartoon Theater, which was hosted by Dick Van Dyke, or adventure shows like Sergeant Preston or The Adventures of Champion. the Wonder Dog. And one of those shows that they put in that time slot was a British-made show called The Adventures of Robin Hood, starring Richard Green. And it was produced by ITC Entertainment in Britain. And the head of ITC was a gentleman named Sir Lou Braid, whom we'll see throughout the initial British invasion of television.
Yeah.
And this show aired on ITV, the Independent Television Network in England, and again on CBS in the United States. Now, a lot of people who may not have seen episodes of Robin Hood are probably familiar with the theme, which was very popular. The Robin Hood, da 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 da. It becomes lampooned on Monty Python a decade later. But Robin Hood proved to be a very popular and very interesting program. It's not thought of as the classic type of television. It's not kitchen sink drama. If anything, it's kind of you could call it a costume drama, but it is really more of an adventure type show that would be geared toward the younger audience. But there are some aspects of it that I think are worth mentioning. Excuse me. It was one of the first television shows to make extensive use of employing blacklisted writers. So among their writing staff, they had Ring Lardner Jr. and Waldo Salt. Howard Koch was one of the production people on it. And not surprisingly, even in an adventure series that was geared toward younger audiences, these writers found a way to import certain contemporary ideas and thoughts into the programming. And one example of that was an episode called A Tuck in Time, where you have Friar Tuck's evil twin brother Edgar, and he's coming back from a trip to the Far East, during which time he discovered the formula for a secret weapon. And it's a weapon that he's intending to sell to Prince John. And so I believe this was Ring Lardner Jr. who wrote this specific episode. And what he's doing is introducing an idea that we were seeing at the time about arms merchants, about people being involved in foreign conflicts, especially as the colonial era was ending in Great Britain. So these had a degree of relevance, political relevance, that you wouldn't automatically think of when you think of an adventure show for children. But they were addressing serious issues, mercenaries, the soldiers of fortune. And so that was very provocative for the time, although I don't think that it was widely commented on in the United States. Anyway, Robin Hood was a huge success for CBS. It ran for 3 seasons. I think it ran for even longer than that in England. But what that did was trigger the studio to make more series that they looked to export to the United States. Sir Lou saw the success of this, realized he had an opportunity, and he sought out other types of programs that would be amenable to the American market, that had a possibility of real success.
Yeah, Lou Grade, we have to do a show on him along with our other buyers, because even though he was a giant in Britain, he was so big in that country that his influence in America is worthy of talking about.
Absolutely. And without him, a lot of the things that we take for granted today don't happen. So he's a big figure. And so what he looked at were other shows that might have the same kind of an appeal to American audiences. For their part, the American networks could pick these programs up at a fairly reasonable price. It would save them the production, and it would give them credible shows that they could use to fill time in their broadcast schedule. Now, the two most prominent shows that came as part of this early wave of programming. The first one was The Adventures of Sir Lancelot, and that was shown on NBC Monday nights at 8 in the 1956-57 season. It's a show cut from the same cloth as The Adventures of Robin Hood. I think for classic TV fans, what's most notable about Sir Lancelot, besides the fact that it's a pretty entertaining show, is that Lancelot is played by the late William Russell, who went on to great fame as Ian Chesterton, one of the original companions on Doctor Who. But this was his first television exposure in the United States, and I wouldn't say that he became a household name by any stretch of the imagination, but he became a familiar enough face. And I think that today, looking back at Lancelot, that's probably the most significant aspect of that program. There's another program that comes along in this same way. This is in the 56-57 season as well. And it's a program that CBS is showing on Saturday nights at 7:30. It's called The Buccaneers. And as you might expect, it's about pirates and about people fighting the Buccaneers and all kinds of sea battles and things of this sort. Now that is notable because the star of the Buccaneers was Robert Shaw, who a lot of people will recognize from Jaws, from his appearance as a James Bond villain, but also from his work as a playwright, a very successful playwright who wrote, among other things, The Man in the Glass Booth. And so Shaw was a very versatile actor and writer, but this was one of his first opportunities coming out of the educational system and the theater, the drama schools in England. One of his first opportunities to appear for wide public consumption was in this TV show. He wasn't impressed by it terribly, but it was a program that would give him experience, visibility, and most of all, money. Not a lot of money, but money. And if you're a starring actor, you like that idea of money. So coming out of the School of Drama, he's put on American television as well as British television. There are some other shows that come out of this stable. They're not widely seen. They're not network programs necessarily. They go into syndication. Oddly enough, they're probably, thanks to YouTube and other streamers and DVDs, they may be better known to the American public now than they were at the time. But you have very similar shows like these historical drama type shows like The Adventures of William Tell, The Adventures of the Scarlet Pimpernel, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Adventures of Sir Francis Drake. You have shows called Sword of Freedom, which is another show about men of fortune, mercenaries, fighting in exotic foreign lands. Now, these shows are not significant because they were hits, but they're significant because they show, whether on the networks or in syndication, and a good many of them went into syndication at that period of time, it shows that a market is developing for British television and for something that was understandable, amenable. I don't know if those are the right words or not, but it was showing that American television was an opportunity that was open to British studios and that they could make shows that would have an American appeal. And I think one of the interesting things about that is a quote from a TV Guide article that ran around that time that said, these shows aren't so different from our Westerns. They're costume dramas, but they're just like Westerns. They tell stories of good versus evil. They're marketed toward the same audience, and they're high excitement. So the British studios had a market here.
So let me ask you a question, because what you're talking about mostly, it seems, with the British invasion are British produced shows. But
Yes.
there were Native American shows that exposed a lot of British films. For example, there was Chiller Theater, there was Creature Feature, there was something called the $1 Million Movie in New York, and these were sort of syndicated shows that were umbrellas for a lot of films. And what they usually consisted of was old film noirs, things like the Dead End Kids, the Bowery Boys, but they would also have a lot of British films. Things like Quatermass and the Pit, which became 20 Million Miles to Earth. They had things like Day of the Triffids, Unearthly Stranger, a lot of high-quality B films that were often better than their American counterparts. But that doesn't sound like that's considered part of the invasion.
Well, it is tangentially, because you look at that as part of that, if you will, invasion of British cinema into American television that was made possible in large part because the American studios were still resisting getting involved in television. So that created an opening for these British films to come over, and whether they were being shown on the network or being shown in packages, as you mentioned, this is adding to this British presence on television. I think it is a very important part of it, especially the science fiction part, because that is creating a niche, a market that the British are able to fill with very good programs. And something else you could look at is, too, you're seeing more British actors becoming familiar to American audiences. An actor like excuse me, it's getting to be that time of the year when the allergies are running free. But an actor like Roger Moore, who cut his teeth in Britain, but he did a show called The Alaskans for Warner Brothers. Previously, he had been one of the Mavericks that took over after James Garner left the series. So you had people like Moore, people like Robert Shaw, that were starting to become more and more familiar to American audiences, and were acting, in Moore's case, were acting in American television shows made by American studios. So there is that aspect to it, not just the shows, but the actors as well.
So you mentioned I think tangentially James Bond, and with Roger Moore, I mean, obviously The Saint was a big thing, and it seems to me by the late 50s, this is when you get The Saint, you get Danger Man, aka Secret Agent, which then led to The Prisoner with McGowan. You get The Avengers, Emma Peel and whatnot, and all of these, and then Doctor Who, I guess, a few years later. These shows that you've talked about, seem to have been mild successes. Was Danger Man or The Avengers, was that the first big British thing hit?
Yes. I would say that in terms of what we're talking about, the first show to make an impact was Danger Man, and that premiered on CBS in 1961, and it was considered an updated version of a costume drama, really. It was still an action-adventure show, but it took place in contemporary times rather than as a period piece. And it was their Cold War stories. They're featuring Patrick McGowan as, in a sense, kind of an anti-Bond. McGowan particularly would stress that, because whereas Bond was a magnet for women, McGowan's character, John Drake, never became involved with women. Whereas Bond had a license to kill, McGowan would resort to violence only as a last resort. And even then, it was rarely of shooting people. It was more often physical violence, being able to knock them out, being able to take them into custody. So there were definitely differences in the philosophical approach between Bond and Drake. But Danger Man, which runs for 39 half-hour episodes, starts out as a very successful program. It does well in the ratings. It makes McGowan something of a star in the United States. It's very profitable for Lou Gray. It is, again, a show that Americans are going to recognize, and that was one of Gray's important aspects of the shows he looked at. He wanted to have programs that would echo American shows, but that were made in Britain. So, interestingly enough, and you mentioned this tangentially when we talked about Bond, Bond has a big effect on television, not only on British television, but on American television. And what happens with a show like Danger Man is that it starts to not become unique because of the impact of Bond. American shows start to ape that, and we should mention, when I'm starting to talk about Danger Man, I should mention there are two versions of Danger Man. One of them is the original that came on in 1961, 39 half-hour episodes. Mildly successful, solid, nothing spectacular. But then Danger Man is revived in 1965. In the United States, it goes under the title of Secret Agent, so that they can use Johnny Rivers' Secret Agent Man as the theme. But it's still Danger Man in England, and it's still the same character. It's John Drake, only now instead of being a NATO agent, who is ostensibly American, actually, but instead of being a NATO agent, he's now completely British. He's working for the British Secret Service. He is a globe-trotting agent. The episodes are now an hour long rather than a half hour. It's allowing for much more of a psychological investigation of the characters as well as the action and adventure.
And the half-hour versions, because I got the DVD. The half-hour versions are good and sometimes occasionally funny, but it goes by so quickly.
Yes.
And John Drake there is portrayed as sort of a cheery misanthrope, whereas in the later ones, I think it hits its stride. I think there's only like 68 episodes total. The latter being hour long, and I think the last two are in color.
Yes, the last two episodes are in color, and they're eventually combined into a feature-length movie. And I'll mention that right at the end of this discussion. Danger Man, as I mentioned, starts out strongly. It has very high ratings, but what does it end? Eventually, I said that it wasn't seen as different enough. But Danger Man is on in the 65, 66 season. And what happens is you start to see other programs, American-made programs, ape the Bond shows. Most prominently, I would say, The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Yeah.
But you also have the introduction of The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. You have...
I Spy.
Yep, I Spy, Batman, running all the range from camp to serious quality adventure. And while Danger Man, or Secret Agent if you will, while that is perceived by many, including the critics, to be of a higher quality, it falls in the ratings because it isn't unique enough. It's also not in color, which I think has something to do with the appeal of some of these other American-made programs. And so the result is that falling from its initial strong ratings, Danger Man goes off the air on CBS after a single season. Instead, it winds up going into syndication. And it stays in syndication for 2 additional years in the United States. And then it will become there's a revival of interest in Danger Man later when we get into The Prisoner, and the reasons will become obvious at that point. But what Danger Man does succeed in doing, I think, is introducing the second phase of the initial British invasion, which is the action-adventure spy genre. And the logical follow-up to Danger Man in these terms is The Saint.
Although it should be said that The Saint goes back to a series of books in the Great Depression.
Yes. Wonderful books too. They're readable, they're exciting, they're entertaining, and a very successful radio program too with Vincent Price, as well as a series of movies. And for people who are fans of The Saint, I mean, everybody has their favorite Saint when it comes to the non-Roger Moore series. I think most people would say that Roger Moore is the definitive Simon Templar, the one and only Simon Templar. But as far as the radio series is concerned, Vincent Price is very good in it. The movies are fun to watch. So The Saint has a pedigree coming into it. It's not an unknown quality. And what's interesting about The Saint is that it's the opposite of Danger Man. Danger Man started out on a network and then went into syndication. The Saint went directly into syndication. It was syndicated throughout the United States, and it became so popular that as a result, it was picked up by a network, NBC. And it ran for 3 half seasons on NBC, primarily as either a summer replacement or as a short-term fall or winter series. There aren't that many episodes of The Saint, but then you have to remember that British television series seldom had as many episodes in a season or in a series as their American counterparts did. They're much shorter term. So The Saint fills that hole, but it's a very successful show. It capitalizes on Moore's familiarity and popularity with American audiences, and it's a fascinating series to watch. And why do I use the word fascinating? Well, because it does in part capture the ruthlessness of Leslie Charteris's original Simon Templar. Templar is a man of justice, a man who will kill when it's necessary to achieve his goal. He looks at killing someone not so much as an act of assassination, but that of execution. He's a man who, as a reformed dual thief, he has a very high standard of justice and morality, which does not always coincide with the traditional legal definition of justice. He has his own justice that he metes out, and particularly in the early episodes of The Saint, you're more likely to see that aspect of the Templar character come out. In the later versions, especially when the series goes into color, you see them become a little more adventurous, perhaps a little less of the ruthless Templar character. One thing that you do see that's fairly consistent through the entire series is the Templar is rarely taken off guard, and he is rarely played for a fool. You will see him walking into a trap in episode after episode, only to find out at the very end that in fact he wasn't walking into a trap. What he had done was set a trap himself for the villains and allow them to think that he was walking into their trap when in fact they were walking into his. So it's a wonderful series for anybody who hasn't seen it or who's only seen it maybe on A&E or on some of the streaming services. It's worth not just the color episodes, but going back a little farther and getting to those original black and white, or as they call it in England, monochrome. If you get the monochrome series, if you get the complete series of The Saint, you'll see the ways that Moore plays this character, and you'll see the way that it alternates between a Cold War series where he's taking on an assignment for a government to a purely adventure series where he's taking on, for lack of a better word, an assignment of an individual who's been wronged, or where he gets involved in something where he sees an injustice being done. It does not strictly follow one method of introducing a Templar into the series. It's just it's an interesting combination of things, and I think that's helped to make it popular at the same time. Plus, you see a lot of stars in all of these series, actually. One of the valuable things about them is that you see a lot of stars before they were stars. Donald Sutherland did a lot of television before he became a movie star. Being a Canadian, he did a lot of British television. So you'll see him in episodes of The Saint. You'll see him in other of these shows that we may touch on. And you'll see that with a lot of other actors and actresses as well. You'll almost see a stable of actors, almost a repertory company that appear in all of these shows at one time or another. It gets to be great fun picking them out when they appear in a different role, sometimes the hero, sometimes the villain, but you get quite familiar with them throughout the course of the series.
Let me just add a couple of comments on the things you had mentioned. And that is, I think, a very important show that is obvious is The Avengers. For a number of reasons. Number one, it starts out black and white, ends up in color. It has a number of female leads, the most prominent being Diana Rigg as Emma Peel. And without Emma Peel, you don't have the Catwoman, Julie Newmar. You probably don't have the tight stuff of Ginger and Marianne on Gilligan's Island. But I think also that show, which got more outlandish. It started off more grounded in the black and white, like The Saint, but it became more outlandish. This, I think, opens up a world of British television that wouldn't have been there. You have, for example, those shows with the puppetronics, with the I forget the
Super
name. Right.
Yeah.
You end up, then you get UFO. Then from UFO you get Space 1999, and so you. The Avengers, I think, is a key series because it's one of those few series in any country's history that really changes from its initial output. It becomes, by its last season, compared to its first season, it's a totally different show.
Yes. Well, what's interesting about the Avengers, as you mentioned, it starts out in black and white. It begins in 1961, and it's quite a different show from what it becomes. It has a very hard edge. The title is actually explained during the course of the first story. The Avengers start out as British agents who are assigned to avenge a wrongdoing. Patrick Macnee is the only figure that appears in all the different variations of the Avengers as John C. And it is Macnee's real-life wife who plays the character who is murdered in the initial episode of the Avengers that leads to the assignment to avenge her death. Now it's a cloak and dagger show. You see Steve wearing a trench coat and a typical hat that you might see being worn by Humphrey Bogart in a detective series. And the people that he's working with are primarily other male agents. It takes a couple of series before the Avengers starts to resemble the series that we would become familiar with. And what you have is the emergence of a female sidekick, Catherine Gale, who is in most ways Steed's equal, and is intelligent, brilliant, I think it would be fair to say. She's an expert in judo and karate. She can handle herself, and she is an outsider. She's not a government agent. She is what they call a talented amateur that Steve is able to recruit to come on board for some of the assignments where he needs someone of her quality to be able to come in and infiltrate a particular organization. And she's played by Honor Blackman. And this makes Honor Blackman an international star, even though the Avengers, her versions of the her episodes of the Avengers aren't seen in this country until they appear on A&E in the 90s. But the Kathy Gale episode set the tone for that era of the Avengers. And it also sees Steve become English gentleman that people would become familiar with. Because of the success of the Avengers, you see American television take an interest in this. And what's notable about the British invasion, I think, as far as the Avengers is concerned, and you can talk about its entertainment value, and we will, but in terms of the business side of things, the Avengers becomes a co-production where ABC, the American network, makes a heavy investment in the Avengers. It allows the show to get out of the studio where it was done on videotape and into different settings, indoor and outdoor. It knocks down the walls, if you will, and allows the show to have a much broader range of things. It also, the following season, will allow the show to go from black and white to color, which is another huge part of the show's appeal. Because it exploits color in such a wonderful way. It captures everything about the mod scene that's going on in England at the time. And the third thing it does is it introduces Emma Peel to Diana Rigg to the series. And she creates yet another aspect of the show. It becomes, as you said, campy at times, more fantastic. You see them battling creatures, monsters. Anybody who would have watched Doctor Who at the time would recognize the Cybernauts, who make a couple of appearances in the Avengers. You see villains who, rather than working for foreign governments, are more likely Bond-type villains that are looking to take over the world. You can almost see them twirling their mustaches. And in fact, there's a very interesting article in TV Guide that predates the appearance of the Avengers on American television. This is when Kathy Gale is still Steve's companion. And it is an exposure, if you will, of the fact that the producers of the Avengers intended the show to be seen as a spy spoof. And no one picked up on it. Everybody looked at it and saw its straight elements and regarded it as a straight action adventure series when, as you mentioned, it was already veering toward this fantastical type of television where you had these colorful villains and you had these stories that were incredible in the sense that you had to really suspend your disbelief. And yet the producers were finding it extremely difficult to convince people that it was a spoof. And it's a cover story on TV Guide, as a matter of fact. They don't have a picture of the show. They just talk about the outrageous British show that's actually a spoof. You have to get in and read the article to find out they're talking about the Avengers. You wouldn't have guessed it. And finally what happens is in the second or third Emma Peel episode, the producers finally decided, okay, we've had enough with trying to convince people that this show is a spoof. We're going to leave no doubt about it. And so what they do is they have Emma captured by some villains, and one of them decides the only way that they can get rid of her is to tie her to the railroad tracks and have a train run over her. And they start playing this piano music that is more suitable for one of the one of the serials of the time, and they drop any pretense that you should be taking this seriously. And Steed is racing against time to untie her from the track or to get the train to go off in a different direction before it's curtains for our hero Emma. Yeah. So at that point, it finally becomes evident what they're trying to do with the show. And this coincides with its appearance on American television. At the same time, it would be a mistake to just write off the Avengers. And I think you hit exactly on the point when you talked about the role that Diana Riggs, Emma Peel, plays in the show. She is an equal to Steed. She is tough. She is smart. Not quite. If you talk to people who watched the British show from the beginning, there's great affection over in Britain for Honor Blackman. And it's not surprising that she would go on from the Avengers to appear in Goldfinger. But as is often the case, the first companion you see is the one you remember most fondly. And there's a great following for Honor Blackman in Britain. And in fact, they will look at the Emma Peel episodes, and they will point out that despite the fact that Diana Rigg has tremendous charisma and sex appeal, despite the fact that she's wearing these leather catsuits and at one point is even wearing a studded collar. Despite all of this, it's most often the case that the episode ends with Steve bailing her out. Mm-hmm. It's seldom the other way around, and it's seldom that she gets herself out of a jam. It's usually the fact that Steve has to come and rescue her. And I think that is an interesting perspective that we perhaps do not see. In fact, when we talk about Honor Blackman's portrayal, something I did not know until relatively recently was that Honey West, the American private detective series, Aaron Spelling, who produced Honey West, as he did the show that spawned it, Burke's Law. Aaron Spelling originally wanted Honor Blackman to play Honey West. This was he had seen the Avengers, and he saw Honor Blackman's Kathy Gale as the kind of character he wanted Honey West to be. Well, she wasn't interested, and so that's how we wound up with the Honey West we did with Anne Francis, who I don't think anybody is complaining about. But it would have been very interesting to see what kind of a show it would have been with someone like Honor Blackman, or if you will, someone like Kathy Gale playing that role. It might have been quite a different show. Would it have been more successful? Not sure, but it would have been a different show. At any rate, I think you're right that without Emma Peel, you don't without Diana Rigg's portrayal of her, you don't have the other female characters that come into television at that time. She creates the template for them, especially in American television, where they hadn't seen the other episodes.
So let me ask. You've talked mostly about networks and syndicated shows. But I know growing up in New York City in the 70s and having vague memories of the late 60s and a little bit better of the early 70s, the place for British television was public television, PBS.
Yes.
And
that's right.
It goes actually back before public television was founded. There was a thing called NET, the National Education Television, or educational television. Mm-hmm. And it started out, WNET in New York was the I guess, anchor station. And I remember the year of 1969, a few weeks before the turning into 1970, I remember that WNET was having something like Top of the Pops, which was a countdown show. They would also had for a couple of years then, I think in 68 or 69, they started carrying Doctor Who. Not only did so they had a popular show. Then they came out with later in the 70s Masterpiece Theater, I Claudius, Upstairs Downstairs, and we became that was the really snooty British era kind of thing. But talk about public television and its impact, because I would argue, I think public television has been more instrumental in bringing British shows over the decades to American public.
Yeah, to understand the role that public television plays in the importation of British television shows, you've got to understand a bit about the background of public broadcasting and the fact that public broadcasting on a national basis started in the 60s and was eventually consolidated, as you pointed out, into NET. But public television was never given a clear mandate from the government as to exactly what it was supposed to be. It also wasn't given a lot of funding. And so most of public television was comprised of local programming, classroom programming during the day, and then various shows that were sometimes local productions, sometimes shows that various educational stations would share, and as you mentioned, imports. One of the earliest imports that I remember on NET was a show called An Age of Kings, which was a series of Shakespeare's Henry plays, Henry III, Henry IV, and the War of the Roses, and the historical dramas of that kind. So we see Sean Connery in one of those, and other British actors that become very familiar to American audiences. But that's one of the first shows that you see get mainstream appeal on NET, and I remember seeing it in my as early as 1963 and 64. You had some of the import shows like that were going directly to public television. Now, what happens with public broadcasting is that it gets caught in a real political situation. As I say, there's great controversy about even funding public broadcasting. Many politicians, not just conservatives and not just Republicans, many politicians are against the idea of a government-funded television network. Many others are committed to the idea that if there is government funding of a television network, there should not be a network schedule of programming. In other words, NET exists as a single entity comprised of 150 local stations. NET's responsibility should not be to program uniform schedules for all of those 150 stations, but to provide them with a certain amount of programming that would be then combined with local programming that each one of the stations or a coalition of those stations would do on their own. And that would retain the educational part of national educational television. So NET came up with shows like NET Playhouse, NET Theater, NET Opera. Those were three of their big shows that were fulfilling NET's mission to provide cultural programming that by and large the networks had given up. Now, much of, although not all of that programming, was imported from Britain. Some of the best NET shows, in fact, were made in the United States, but there was a lot of programming that we look at that was actually coming from anthology war horses in England, like Armchair Theater, and so these were gaining a foothold again in the United States. The programming was relatively inexpensive. It had that reputation that was coming over from shows that had been seen on American television already. It had that reputation for quality programming, and it filled gaps in NET's national schedule. Now, come 1969, and I realize this may be more than most people want to know about public broadcasting, but I think it's essential to get to the stage that you were talking about. When Richard Nixon is elected president in 1969, or in 1968, when he becomes sworn in 1969, there's a very critical look at what public broadcasting should be. And by critical, I mean it in the sense that we're going to sit down and really take a look at this. some of that critical investigation was critical in the sense that it was criticizing the programming. They had shows like PDL, which stood for Public Broadcasting Laboratory, that were irreverent, that were often critical of the establishment, that took on what would be seen then as a hard left message that was contained in their programming. That became the bane of the Nixon administration. President Nixon vetoed a public broadcasting funding bill. All of a sudden, public broadcasting finds itself in some serious trouble about what exactly it's going to provide its stations. In addition, you have stations like KTCA, which is the affiliate in St. Paul, Minneapolis, who were very anti-NET. By that, they felt that there should be much more of a local emphasis. They did not want NET taking over their schedule. In fact, they didn't join NET formally. If you look at the TV guides, KTCA is one of the last of the educational television stations to be identified as such, rather than as simply educational. They're one of the last to be identified as PBS and or NET. They maintain their educational description up until almost the very end. So what you've got is you've got a network with restless affiliates that isn't programming a nationwide schedule, that's not saying when most of that programming is going to be on, and that can't get money to do very much. What do? Well, they came up with an interesting idea. Somebody, Nancy West, who's written about Masterpiece Theater extensively, said that public broadcasting, as we know it, came out of this kind of despair over what was coming across the airwaves, and they wanted to do something quality with it. And so the program that NET latched onto was called the Forsyth Saga. The Forsyth Saga was based on the novels of James Galsworthy, who'd won a Nobel Prize in fiction. It's a series of 9 books, each grouped into 3 books of 3, so 9 altogether. And the Forsyth Saga was a sensation when it was run in Britain in 1969. It was one of the first examples of must viewing. It was, to be honest, it's a soap opera. It has big families. It has dramatic stories, sweeping, epic scale. It's the prototypical costume drama that we've come to think of from the Brits. But it became something of almost a religious experience for people in Britain when they watched it. They changed the times of evening church services on Sunday so that they wouldn't conflict with the Forsyth Saga. People would get together to watch the show, and they would invite people over. They would discuss it before and after. You imagine what TV is like today with this discussion on social media. You take out the social media aspect, that's what the Forsyth Saga does. Comes over to the United States, and NET pays a phenomenally low price for it. They bought the entire 26 episodes for $170,000. Now that may sound like a lot of money, especially for a network that's having trouble funding. But let's put that into context. ABC was paying $140,000 an episode for the Avengers. NET is getting the entire 26 weeks of the Forsyth Saga for $170,000. And so it is filling an hour-long weekly gap, and it's rerun a couple of times maybe during the week by a lot of stations. It's filling a hole in the schedule, it's filling a hole in the budget, and it becomes a smash hit. It it isn't really any different from American soap operas. In fact, if you watch the episodes, the production values aren't any different from American soap operas. There's a focus on static settings, on extreme close-ups, on usually only having two people in a scene at a time, and the camera going back and forth. It's not much different from what you would have seen on some of the higher quality American daytime soaps. But one of the things that we've talked about here with British television is its reputation for quality. And so the Forsyte Saga is seen as a quality soap opera. It is a literary soap opera because of its credentials. It also appeals to a time past. Somebody called it a mild nostalgia for a lost community, a lost way of life, something that Americans have always been interested in. And so it develops the same kind of following that it did over in the UK. It is not coincidentally shown on Sunday nights. That's a forerunner to Masterpiece Theater. And it develops this following of people who talk every week about what's happening to them. And they're even having difficulty separating the characters from the actors and actresses who are playing them. So in that respect, it is almost identical to how viewers reacted to daytime soap operas. They took it very much to heart.
So in the 1970s, there seemed to be a stratification on public television of British shows. By then, I think the networks had pretty much abandoned it. And the three strata seemed to be the most... well, you'd have the I Claudiuses, you'd have the Forsyte Sagas. These were the costume dramas with the literary pretensions.
Upstairs, downstairs.
Then you had a whole bevy of science or social science shows like Kenneth Clark's Civilizations in 1969, and running for the whole decade of the 70s up until we get to Carl Sagan, who sort of Americanizes that kind of genre. But underneath it all, you had a lot of lowbrow humor and lowbrow stuff. On the science, on the sci-fi side, you had Doctor Who in the Tom Baker years. You had Blake Seven and assorted shows like that, which were really 1930s level in terms of props and monster of the week kind of thing. But you also had comedy like Monty Python. The week, this was the week that was, or whatever the actual title.
That was the week that was, yeah.
And then you also had Benny Hill became a star. I remember in the late 70s, Benny Hill in New York. If you wanted to see unbraziered breasts, you'd watch the Benny Hill show. If you wanted to see humor based upon penises or something, and how many different ways a British person could describe or talk about a penis, it was Benny Hill. So you had the very lowbrow stuff, you had the highbrow soap operas, and then you had the science stuff. How did that come about? Was that just was that a plan that PBS wanted to corner the market of these things?
Well, the documentaries and science shows that you mentioned, it's interesting that they did have a network presence at one time, before the network started seeing these as shows that they couldn't make any kind of a profit off of. You had programs like The Search for Michelangelo and the Jacques Cousteau shows. What happened in that case was that the shows were taken more or less intact, but they replaced the British narration with American narration. So you might have a British actor or expert doing the narration when it was seen on the BBC or ITV, but when it's seen over here, you got Joe Campanella or Rod Serling. So they're being Americanized in a sense, and that's typical in a way of what we're seeing in one half of this British programming. When you talk about how it starts to come over onto public broadcasting, that's a gradual process as as is almost all the rest of this. At first, what you saw were British shows that were remade for American television. So you had, Steptoe and Son, which became Sanford and Son, and Till Death Do Us Part became All in the Family. You had a sense, especially with the comedies, that the British sense of humor did not translate well to Americans. Mm-hmm. They weren't going to get the jokes. And that held up even through the early part of Monty Python. Now, a lot of people don't realize that the first time Monty Python was shown in this country, it was shown on a network. I think it was Jack Parr who showed it on one of his programs. He thought it was funny, but it didn't create much of a stir, and that lent to the idea that these shows had to be Americanized, that people wouldn't understand the peculiar British sense of humor. So when you talk about the comedy aspect of it, and I'm by no means an expert on all of these shows, but I think what you see is a distribution process where Doctor Who, for example, was part of the BBC's syndication, or Lionheart, I think it was called. Lionheart was the syndication arm of the BBC, and so they were responsible for taking BBC-made shows and bringing them into an American audience. That's how you had a show like Doctor Who, or you had some of the costume dramas that the BBC was doing. They were appearing on both commercial and public broadcasting stations. When Doctor Who was first syndicated, it was syndicated on commercial stations, and it was syndicated into local networks. I remember the KSTP, which again was the NBC affiliate at the time in Minneapolis. They showed Doctor Who weekday afternoons at 5 o'clock, just before the evening news, just as if it was a rerun of Hogan's Heroes. The other thing a lot of these stations, local stations, didn't realize is that Doctor Who was a serial. Which meant that it mattered what they showed them in the half-hour episodes, but it mattered what order those were shown in. And a lot of the time they didn't do that. So Doctor Who, when it first was shown on commercial television in America, was a bomb. It wasn't until it was picked up by public broadcasting stations that it became more successful. Now, my thought, which is an uneducated thought, is that a lot of this has to do, when you're talking about everything from the lowbrow, like Benny Hill, to the shows like Faulty Towers, anything that covers this, where these shows were imported directly from Britain and not remade as American versions, I think it comes from the success that PBS was having with Masterpiece Theater, mm-hmm. and opening up the door. Now, we left off with the Forsyte Saga. I just want to mention one last piece of the puzzle with Masterpiece Theater. Masterpiece Theater grew out of the Forsyte Saga. You notice that the Forsyte was shown on Sunday evenings, and so Masterpiece Theater is as well. The biggest piece of the puzzle is that these shows are still affordable. Upstairs, Downstairs, these other series were relatively affordable compared to what it might cost for PBS to do their own programs. And so for that reason, again, and with the constant funding troubles that the network has always had, these shows became very, very popular. Not that they became popular from a viewing standpoint, but they were popular from a budget standpoint as well. And especially if you were going to put them into parts of the schedule that weren't being filled by national PBS programming. Unlike NET, PBS did begin a national schedule. And so you're looking at times of the day when that programming isn't being shown. Ergo, the show's coming on at 11 or 11:30, and a little earlier on that on the weekends. When Masterpiece Theater's biggest coup was that PBS was able to get mobile to underwrite it. So you had a program programming that was already affordable, that was even more affordable now that the Mobil Oil Corporation was going to pay a significant hunk of the acquisition costs. And so that's specifically where Masterpiece Theater comes from. The first presentation of Masterpiece Theater was the first Churchill's, and that was again an episodic, serial, limited run series costume drama, but this had the added benefit of being based on true stories with a name that all Americans recognized, Churchill. Yeah. And the fact that he was half American to begin with, because his mother was an American, didn't hurt. So this is the story, becomes the story of Winston Churchill's predecessors. And from there you get Upstairs, Downstairs, you get I, Claudius, you get other shows. You begin to see WGBH, which is the Boston PBS affiliate, taking on that same co-production status that ABC did when they were doing the Avengers. So now a lot of these shows are co-productions of the Britain and the United States. Now that doesn't answer the question about these other programs specifically, but I think it does demonstrate how the British influence on public broadcasting becomes so pronounced. You already have the success with the prestige and glamour shows, and you're finding out that British sense of humor, that British sense for history and for costume drama, that's not so foreign to American audiences after all. And in fact, now the tables are turned. CBS tries an American version of Upstairs, Downstairs. It was called Beacon Hill, I believe. That's a tremendous bomb. Why? Because it's not a British show. And at this point, I don't know if it was any good either. I didn't live in an area of the country that got it, which is a different story. But Beacon Hill is not a success, even though it is posited as the American Masterpiece Theater. And one of the reasons why is because it doesn't have the British trappings, it doesn't have the British accents, and it doesn't have this suggestion that equates British television with quality television. People, in fact, become great Anglophiles over television, and they start to equate British TV with quality TV to an extent that is far greater than what it deserved. A lot of British TV was terrible. Yeah. It's just that those shows weren't imported into this country. It was only the good ones. We didn't see what they saw all the time. We only saw the versions that were marketable and came over here. And so you had the science fiction shows, which I think stand alone. Blake 7 and Doctor Who and shows of that kind. They're not highbrow, they're not lowbrow. They are campy in their appearance, but they are serious in the topics that they are broaching. Yeah. And you have Harlan Ellison, great writer, who says that in his opinion, Doctor Who is the greatest science fiction show ever produced. He tells a bunch of students, if all you think of science fiction is Star Trek, let me tell you, Star Trek is kids' play compared to Doctor Who. Well, he wasn't talking about the production values. He wasn't talking about the hokey monsters or anything. He was really talking about the content of the show. And so on these science fiction shows, they maintained something of an adult, serious quality that is addressing issues that the British public certainly recognized as being serious ones, whether they were talking about the miners' strikes or the inequality in classes or anything like that. The writers of Doctor Who often just took a page out of Rod Serling's book and presented allegories on other planets that were demonstrating these serious issues.
Well, I think at some point maybe we can do a Lou Grade and Tom Baker double pack of British.
I may even get to wear my Tom Baker scarf and hat. I might dress in costume for that one.
So we're going to probably do a show on the second British invasion. So how does the first British invasion sort of wrap up? Does it go into decline? And because as far as I can recall, the term Britcom becomes popular at the end of the 90s. So we're talking maybe a 15-year period from the early 80s to the late 90s where, there's really nothing special, I think, at least, or memorable that comes from Britain into the U.S. then.
I'm going to say that the first British invasion ends in around 1972 or 73.
Oh, okay.
It ends, the first British invasion really ends with Masterpiece Theatre. I think Masterpiece Theatre sets the stage for what's to come, both highbrow and lowbrow. And one thing that can't be overlooked about Masterpiece Theatre is that it provides a sense of closure in a way. Masterpiece Theatre's episodes generally run about 50 minutes. They conform to the broadcast standards of British television. However, in America, they need to fill up the entire hour, minus the
commercials.
Or in the case of PBS, the viewers like you thing.
Yeah.
So what Masterpiece Theatre had to do is find a way to fill the extra time, and they did that. They decided they needed a host. Somebody who could explain, who could put the show into a context that Americans would understand, whether it was historical or class-based or cultural, what have you. And the host they chose was none other than Alistair Cook. So it comes full circle from Omnibus all the way around to Masterpiece Theatre. And I think that's a nice sense of closure. Now, speaking more broadly, when we talked about whether the British invasion died down, yeah, it did. You look at the Saint, and the Saint influenced Greg to bring more series over. The difference being that although they were made in Britain, British productions, British guest stars, and a British setting, they would have American actors as stars to make it more marketable to the American market. So they had, for instance, a quartet of shows that of varying popularity that demonstrated this. One of the shows was called The Baron, and it starred the American actor Steve Forrest. It ran as a summer replacement or winter-summer replacement in 1966 on ABC. I would say the capsule version of that is it's the Saint as an American. The Baron is a antiques dealer and very wealthy, but otherwise the stories he gets into are remarkably similar to the Saint. You have a show called Court Martial, which fulfills the same type of function for ABC, in that it was a mid-season replacement. It stars Bradford Dillon and Peter Graves, and it has to do with, it's a courtroom drama about court martials. So it has to do with military, mostly in Europe. You have a wonderful show called Man in a Suitcase that doesn't get nearly enough attention. It starred the American actor Richard Bradford, and that was a 1968 ABC series, and he was a private detective who had been forced out of the British intelligence services and now functioned as a private investigator while at the same time trying to clear his name. Then you had a show that was kind of a mix between almost a superhero series, a spy series, and a private eye series. It's called The Champions, and it starred Stuart Damon, Alexandra Batesto, and William Gaunt. And that was on NBC in 1968 as well. Now, the 2 points that I make about this, and the reason that we're looking at them right now, is because all 4 of them came from the popularity of The Saint. All 4 of them only lasted 1 season. So at this point, you're seeing that British invasion start to peter out. The Avengers, which we talked about at length earlier, goes off the air in 1969. It's canceled in Britain. It's canceled in the United States by ABC. The ratings are going down. Linda Thorson isn't nearly as popular a sidekick for Steed as Diana Rigg was, and so ABC cancels it. Without ABC's funding, the Avengers is not able to continue over in Britain. So now we're starting to see the flip side of this, the American influence on British television. So the Avengers is canceled, comes back later with American funding as the new Avengers, another story. I would say that this aspect of British television, excluding where it goes to Masterpiece Theatre, the network example of British television and the British invasion, although there will be some crossovers, I think that the most dominant show and the place where it probably ends for the purposes of our discussion as being the success is The Prisoner. And The Prisoner is another import. It's a spin-off from Danger Man / Secret Agent. Patrick McGowan is once again the star as well as the brain trust of it. You mentioned that there were 2 color episodes of Danger Man. The reason there are only 2 color episodes of it is that because as they started the color season, McGowan decided he wanted to do The Prisoner instead. And so Secret Agent is canceled after only 2 episodes, but the entire production crew, writers, actors, everybody involved behind the scenes, all move over to The Prisoner.
Yeah.
The Prisoner is a sensation in Britain. It is a summer replacement series for the Jackie Gleason show in the United States. It runs in the summer of 1967. It runs again in the summer of 1968. It's every bit as confusing and controversial in this country as it was in England. After that, you don't see very many British imports, and the ones you see are starting to go more and more toward public broadcasting. Therefore, I say that the first British invasion ends.
Well, as someone who watched General Hospital, soap opera for going on 50 years, I know Stuart Damon more as Alan Quartermain, but I did think I saw one episode, and it's another example. He was an American actor where you had an American actor as the lead, romantic lead, or whatever you want to call it, in the Champions. But we'll be back at some point in the future to continue talking about the Britons, and in the next few weeks we'll be back again to talk about some other aspect of American television with Mitchell Hadley. So again, Mitch, thanks. Always a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Same here. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you later.